Before I begin, guys, this is Hamza from Gaza. He has a big family of 12 and they all rely on this donation link to survive. Therefore, it would really mean a lot if you could donate to him no matter how little. The donation link will be in the description. Also, guys, an Indian activist, Sonam Wangchuk, has been on a fast for more than 19 days now as a form of protest against our government for students' rights. He has lost more than 9 kgs and the government still has not acknowledged his case. He could die at this rate. Therefore, please sign the petitions that you see on the screen right now. I'll also link them down below. Thank you. So you know how Ariana Grande's recent pics from her concert got viral where she looked unhealthily and dangerously thin? And the internet was once again flooded with video essays talking about how skinny is back and it's here to stay. And I decided to jump on the bandwagon too. So here we are. However, this is not going to be a video where I talk about how these influencers and pop stars are propagating these dangerous beauty standards that are influencing teens and developing eating disorders in them. But I want to dig much deeper because I want to know, why are we all so obsessed with being unhealthily frail? Because look at this. If one had to make a compulsory choice between the two most dangerous sides of the spectrum, that is being deadly thin or being deadly fat, the vast majority, if not all, would choose to be deadly thin. And it is not just a coincidence that's coming out of nowhere. I watched Salem Tower's video on this Ariana Grande topic, and in that video, she mentioned how skinny is different for Black people and white people.
And it's something that I've observed as a non-white person. And it's actually a conversation that has been going around right now on TikTok, how there is a difference between people of color skinny and then white people skinny.
The people that I'm seeing now, like the white people saying what white people's skinniness is, would be considered emaciated in the Black community.
Like, there are different standards of skinny, so a skinny Black person would still be seen as fat to the white folks. In that video, she also mentioned that while a lot of people were critiquing Ariana's current body and they were scared for her, there was also this part of the internet that was calling people like Sabrina Carpenter big. Sorry, what? I think a large part of the world has confused thinness with starvation, and I think it particularly seems to be the case for white women. Yes, I'm adding race here in the conversation because the origins of fatphobia have a very racist foundation. Yes, fat phobia didn't just come out of, like, what aesthetic standard pleased the eye in one era, that, oh, thinness looked pretty on women so we made thinness. No, it has a racist element. And to see how, we must look at it chronologically and go back to the Renaissance, when the African slave trade had begun, and a time when Europeans could own these exotic beings that not only represented the exotic lands far away, but also the European conquest of those said lands. So it happened in 1521, basically 16th century, when Albrecht Dürer, a renowned German painter from the Renaissance times, was passing through Antwerp, Belgium, when he saw this beautiful Black slave with a beautiful body named Katharina. In Dürer's own words, Katharina's body was so well built and handsome that he couldn't conceive how to better it. And what did Katharina's body look like? Her body was big, fleshy, and quote-unquote fat, because fat was the beauty standard of the time. Renaissance hailed proportionality and fleshiness onto women's bodies. Proportionality, meaning that there was a balance between the sizes of a woman's different body parts. So like, if a painter drew a woman with a big butt, they would also draw her with a bigger stomach and big boobs so that her body seemed harmonious. And this proportionality was considered to be the most important aspect to draw beautiful bodies. And a vast majority of Dürer's works included fat women. In those times, more than the body weight, it was proportionality in a woman's body that made her beautiful. So a fat woman with a proportional body was beautiful. The opinion at the time was that, yeah, while Africans had grotesque faces with their thick lips and flat nose, when it came to their physical bodies at least, they gave the white European women a run for their money. African women at the time were considered to be the lower class and lower status counterparts to the white European female beauty. They also began to show up a lot in paintings, and even though they were dressed in like headdresses and dull garbs to show their servile status, the European painters and the Renaissance painters never compromised when drawing their bodies, at least. For example, these are some examples of the paintings, and if you look at those, you would see that African bodies have been genuinely drawn. Like, there doesn't seem to be any intention of inferiorizing their bodies by these Renaissance painters yet. Both the white bodies and the black bodies have been drawn similarly. They both have like big, toned, muscular arms and legs and fleshy stomachs. Now, in the 16th century, there was obviously some preference for like medium bodies, meaning a body being not too thin, not too fat. However, if one had to fiddle with either side of the spectrum, it was still preferable to be more fat than to be more thin. Completely different from our choice today, where we would be rather too thin than being too fat. Now, this was also the age of neoclassicism, meaning that people wanted a revival of the Greek and Roman culture, the philosophies, the art, architecture, and in this case, the aesthetic female beauty. The Florentine Academy in Italy resurrected this neoclassical beauty by drawing various portraits of the Roman goddess of love named Venus. And this Venus again had porcelain white skin, she was fleshy, well endowed, and she had this modesty where she was trying to cover her private parts. In 1581, we also got an African Venus sculpted. And if you look at this Venus, by contrast to the white Venus, she is not hiding her private parts. In fact, she seems to be so full of vanity that she continues to stare at herself, at her reflection in the mirror. And the way I personally saw it is that I think it has something to do with the stereotype of Africans being hypersexual, and which is why this African Venus is not hiding her private parts. But again, if we were to just look at how her physical body has been sculpted, it looks really similar to the white Venus. Now, this is all to show that, yeah, while in those times African faces were deemed unattractive because they did not have the European long, big, pointy nose and thin lips, their bodies at least were appreciated. But then came the 17th century, and this was the time when Black women's bodies started becoming more like the counterpoints to the European bodies than, as they were earlier, the lower class counterparts to the European bodies. We turn to England and we see that there had started brimming this disgust with fat bodies amongst men, because being fat was equated to being stupid, being of a dull mind, and lacking discipline. However, still, it was only for men that being fat was deemed disgusting and fleshiness was still appealing onto women, which is why we see that in the 17th centuries, colonialists, racists, journalists that started to describe African people as little, low, and foul, which really doesn't seem to make sense because just right now in the previous centuries, they were being celebrated for their big, beautiful bodies. Therefore, there's a reason to suspect that this observation of them being little, low, and foul was not really based on objectivity or truth. All the burgeoning philosophers in the English Enlightenment advocated for temperance, meaning controlled eating and drinking, and only consuming light foods, light grains, having a vegetarian diet, consuming milk, and they all advocated against corpulence. However, it was only in the 18th century when this dietary revolution was really stirred because of the anticipated harm from the delicacies that colonialism had brought to the English household, namely sugar. For over a century now, there was a fear with sugar's overconsumption that was making British people disgustingly fatter and fatter and was eating away at their wits. Now, this 18th century was also the time when fleshiness was no more appealing even onto women. This was also the time when race science emerged as transatlantic slave trade was at its peak. Race science to have a later go on to become eugenics. It said that Africans were monstrously fat and obese because they were always surrounded by pastures and trees full of fruit, so they kept eating and eating without any restraint. So they're corpulent, they lack discipline, and they lack mental institutions. These race scientists also said that being fat was constitutional to African people, meaning that they're inherently incapable of controlling their appetite. So a white person gets fat, that person can still be saved because being white, they have a higher mental aptitude and they can control their appetite and they can control their indulgence into foods. But when it came to African people, they are a hopeless case. Now, this lifestyle of the Africans, all the supposed eating, it was seen as primitive, and the elite white European culture would want to be seen as anything but primitive. So they doubled down on being thin, on being physically, socially, and lifestyle wise different from these people. Now, in the 18th century, religion also spearheaded this cause because it said that, overfeeding and over consuming is abusing your body, and that is not a human being's right. That prerogative only belongs to God as they created us in their image. And so it's our duty to save and be responsible for this body. The white colonialists said that Africans, they had no God, no culture, and they were deformed. They were primitive, and the race scientists, when making these claims, and when they would draw like Africans, like the sketches of their faces, they would deploy these stereotypes where they would say that the fact the Africans' mouth and lips are jutted out, as opposed to Europeans whose forehead is protruding out, shows that Africans' primary function is to eat, while Europeans' primary function is to think. Now, in the 18th century, another thought that gained momentum in the English Enlightenment society was the identity of English people as Anglo-Saxons. This could be traced back to 16th century when King Henry VIII wanted to separate from Norman papacy. I don't really know much about it, but I'm guessing it is some Christian denomination that the king wanted out of. So basically saying that English people were Anglo-Saxons meant that they descended from a pre-Norman Germanic tribe, so they were different from the people of Norman papacy, and this was their way of establishing a different ancestry. But they did not just establish a different ancestry, they also created a hierarchy in white people, where Anglo-Saxon was the finest race and the race at the top, and everything else came below them. Now, this Anglo-Saxon identity gained wide momentum in 18th century, but not only in the British society, but also in the American society. And this Anglo-Saxon identity would go on to play a major role in the race making in the United States. And again, being thin and having swelled bodies were a trademark and also the pride of the Anglo-Saxon women. Now, in this 18th century, all the race scientists, philosophers, nutritionists, even beauticians in the US encouraged the Anglo-Saxon people, whose ancestry could be traced back to Britain, to only procreate with other Anglo-Saxon people and save their race from being polluted. There was a major disgust with Celtic Irish people, Southern Italians, and Russians who had immigrated to the US because this population of whites was seen as hybrid, meaning that they were not considered pure whites, but they were seen to have either a part African identity or part Asian identity, and so they had a mix of those hopeless races in them. And so they should not procreate with the pure and like elite white Anglo-Saxon race. The race science said that these people, like the Celtic Irish, Southern Italians, and Russians, they were universally not as muscular. They universally had darker hair, darker eyes, comparatively darker complexion, and they were also of short stature. Then came the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and this was a time when the United States began to see a lot of immigration influx from Southern and Eastern European and also a lot of Jewish immigration. So now it was this subset of white people that became the new target of race scientists and also the new threat to the vitality of the American nation. So what happened in the 19th century was that the Anglo-Saxon race had begun to adopt the Celtic Irish and Russians, and together they became this Aryan race that was the purest, the finest, the healthiest, and the most elite race. And again, they saw these Eastern and Southern Europeans as inferior or lesser than. Because again, this subset of white was perceived to have a hybrid identity, that they were part Asian or part African, which makes them lesser than. The reason I'm mentioning all this is to show that there exists racism even amongst the whites. And the only reason some of these whites are seen as inferior is because of their supposed part African or part Asian lineage. And those of you who say that, oh, it's the 21st century, it doesn't happen anymore. Remember the time when Trump said that, oh, why don't we get immigrants from Norway or the Scandinavia? We love to have some good people amongst us. I wonder what part of Europe is Norway in? Northern Europe? Now, the 19th and 20th centuries, I know. See, the thing is that a lot of these things were happening at the same time. So, yeah, timeline could be a bit confusing, but bear with me. So, the 19th and 20th centuries were also the time where nutritionists like John Harvey Kellogg, you know that guy, Kellogg's Cornflakes, Kellogg's Chocos? Yeah, that guy. So, John Harvey Kellogg and other nutritionists started becoming anxious because they thought that American women had taken thinness too far, that they became too thin to even produce babies. And if this Anglo-Saxon or Aryan race could not produce fine babies, then the nation might as well go extinct. 20th century was the time when weight scales became a staple in every American household, and this was also the time when science and medicine had replaced religion in monitoring women's bodies. So you know how I mentioned that from 17th to 19th centuries, sects of Christianity such as Protestantism or puritanical beliefs control women's bodies, saying that overfeeding your body is like abusing your body, and you cannot do that because it's God's creation, you must respect it. Now this role was handed from religion to science and medicine to keep women's bodies in check. Now, it was science who filled this role, who told us how to live a healthy life, and who monitored people's, especially women's weight. Now, you must be like, oh, what's wrong with it? It's science that's telling us how to live healthy, and if science is saying that being fat is unhealthy, then we should believe it. But the science was not really based in objectivity or like logical truth. Because, okay, so people like Kellogg never mentioned non-white races in their journals when they were talking about health, and not just because they didn't care, like that's obvious, like they didn't care about us, but also because they thought that these non-white races, especially the African black race, was nearing extinction anyways. So they could not be helped even if Kellogg wanted to. Moreover, it's good if they go extinct because then people like Kellogg, they wouldn't have to worry about those lowly races intermixing with their elite fine race. This is not logical or rational, the two hallmarks that science boasts of. Anyways, the science of the 20th century said that women under 30 should become a little fat, but once they cross 30, they should strive to becoming thin again. This was also the time when BMI was appropriated. So BMI was actually created by a Belgian mathematician, Adolphe Quintlet, or Quetelet, whatever. So this formula was created by him to measure weight along a population, but it was never intended to measure obesity. That, oh, a BMI over 25 is obese. That was never his intention. However, in the 20th century, an American psychologist, Ancel Keys, he appropriated this formula, he named it BMI, and now he made it a measure to check one's obesity. Now, the book that I've been referring in this entire video is called Featuring the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fatphobia, written by Sabrina Strings, and it's one of the most intellectual books I've ever read, and I highly recommend you to read this because the way Sabrina constructs her arguments, it's just so seamless, detailed, and at the same time supported by evidence. And also the language of her book is not over the top. Like the vocabulary is not old, so it's easy to understand, and like you once you get in the flow, it's really interesting. So I highly recommend it. And in the book, Sabrina also discussed that in 2013, two completely contradictory researches were published on obesity. So one research was correlating obesity with mortality rate that was published in American Journal of Public Health. And of course, the study's findings were that obesity caused 18% of deaths in population and that black women were its highest victims. And that this research should be a wake-up call for black women. Of course, all the major news outlets and media houses like CNN, they ran with this story. They used the image of fat black women as their cover page. However, in that same year, a similar study on the same topic of obesity, but yielding different results, was also published, but it did not get any media attention at all. So, research by Catherine Flegel, an epidemiologist who had been studying obesity in population for 2 decades, and who's also one of the most cited researchers in the world when it comes to topics about obesity. She published a research in the Journal of American Medical Association where her study had analyzed 97 prior studies done on this topic of obesity, and she came to the conclusion that obese people had a 6% lower mortality rate than people in the normal categories of BMI. The only media attention that this study got was all negative press. Media houses saying stuff like the study's illegitimate and its findings are just rubbish. The Harvard School of Public Health conducted a symposium to deconstruct, analyze, and conclude how this study's findings were absolutely wrong. 200 people were a part of that symposium. Strings makes a point in her book that the media or the society or the big other, I mean, she did not say the big other, I'm saying the big other, but she said that all these institutions are trying to make this obesity epidemic way bigger than it really is, when in actuality, what we really have is an Ozempic epidemic. And honestly, I agree with her. Like, there are so many videos on this topic already, like how skinny is back, and all these beauty standards that are forcing women to be skinny, they are now also urging them to take Ozempic. So much so that the demand is greater than the supply. And now diabetic patients who really need this medicine for more than just aesthetic purposes can get access to it. A point that Strings also makes, which I think is so well put, is that this instilling fear of this fat other serves not one, but two major purposes. It not just alienates these people of like other non-white races, but simultaneously, this fear instilling of the fat also controls white women's bodies. It polices white women's bodies. This narrative continues to keep them dangerously thin, tamed, and also makes their bodies into this public discourse where every philosopher, every nutritionist, every scientist, they can all comment on this body. They can all expect this body to be regulated by them, and they all feel this inherent right to monitor this body. Look, I'm not saying that obesity isn't dangerous. Okay, first let me make it clear what I don't think obese is. I don't think BMI 30 or the likes is obese. When I say obese, I mean people who are so dangerously fat that it could be life-threatening and fatal. But at the same time, I really think that this fat, the obesity epidemic has been made way bigger than it really is. Because, like String said, we really have a skinny epidemic. So back in college, I used to have this friend who used to justify skipping all her meals. Like whenever I would ask her, like, "Hey, why didn't you have food?" She would say stuff like, "Oh, I was not hungry anyways. Moreover, whenever I eat, I get this urge to puke anyways." It was not a stomach bug. She would look at herself in the mirror for hours and hours and constantly fussing over her body, saying stuff like, "Oh, if I were skinny, then I could have as much junk food as I wanted to. I could wear dresses." And forget about her, just take me for instance. I guess I have been skinny for all my life, but not gonna lie. Whenever I feel that I'm gaining even a slightest amount of weight and I start feeling that my stomach is getting fleshy, I start panicking. I start controlling my diet. I start hitting the gym because skinny privilege is real. And we do live in a fat phobic world, and I don't want to let go of my skinny privilege. And I know this makes me sound like such a hypocrite that, oh, she made this entire video talking about how being fat phobic is being racist. And guys, I'll admit this. I am not brave enough to fight against the norm all on my own. Like, if I wake up tomorrow and I see that a good part of the population, like, not necessarily majority, not necessarily a large part of the population, but like a good amount of people are turning away from the skinny standard, I would gladly go along with it. But I need a team. I'm too much of a coward to do it alone. And although today's world is fat phobic, what we have to realize is that it was not always this way. Renaissance literally hailed fat women as the epitome of beauty. And what this shows us is that the beauty standards, or like these standards of aesthetic, are never really constant. They're always changing. And so this fat phobia of the current world doesn't need to be constant or permanent either. We can change it and we can make body positivity the norm.